A dominant Max Verstappen victory highlighted the differences between Norris and Verstappen. Despite starting P17, Verstappen went on to win without a single mistake in the race, while Lando Norris started on pole. Norris incorrectly did a second formation lap. He lost the lead to George Russell in the first corner. He pitted when the VSC was ending and it was clear the race was going to be stopped. He had a rolling start mistake that allowed Russell to get ahead of him again, and another mistake after the safety car restarted made him lose more positions. All of that meant that Lando Norris was 30 seconds behind Verstappen by the end of the race, and his championship hopes are over. Let's get into all that and more after the Brazilian Grand Prix. Hello everybody, my name is Michael, and welcome back to Last to First. Let's start off with the pure chaos of the whole weekend, really, but particularly the beginning of the race. I mean, it was a crazy day altogether after qualifying was delayed yesterday, and it had to be done early today, with the race being pushed ahead of time as well after some inclement weather was predicted later on in the day. And of course, we had plenty of weather throughout qualifying and the race as well. But starting off at the beginning of the race, before it even got underway, of course, Lance Stroll really started off all the craziness of the race. He wound up crashing on the formation lap and then beached himself in the gravel after literally just driving into it. I'm not sure what he was thinking, but we'll get into that a little later on. After that, that caused the formation lap to be aborted, of course, because there was a car stranded and a driver stranded. Despite the formation lap being aborted and the start procedures needing to be restarted as well, Lando Norris went for a second formation lap, and in this case all of the drivers were supposed to remain as they were and not go on a second lap like he tried to do, because the entire start procedure had to be completely restarted. If it was just a minor delay, then the formation lap would have just been restarted and they would have continued, but with a car on the grid like that, the entire procedure had to be restarted, and Lando Norris should have known that, so he made a big mistake, and he is still being investigated for that. I don't know what that is going to entail after everything, but we will see in the future. But yeah, had it been just a second normal formation lap, then everything would have been just fine, but that's not what it was. All of that can cause confusion down the grid, with some drivers electing to follow suit and others not, and then there was drivers in wrong grid spots, and then the entire starting procedure had to be delayed and restarted again because of all of that. So that just immediately was the icing on the cake for what the weekend had been so far. It was just more chaos and just more mind-blown situations and not knowing what to think of it at all. But then eventually we got restarted and there was plenty more to talk about throughout the race. Of course, I think we have to start off with the Verstappen brilliance. I mean, he started P17. It was actually P15 after Stroll's crash and Albon didn't start. Big disappointment for Albon, by the way, but he still had plenty of work to do, and he managed to keep it clean, keep it focused, and he didn't make a single mistake throughout the entire race, which is really shocking. And after just one single lap, he made it to P10, which was very, very significant for the rest of his race. He gained the majority of those places at turn 3 going around the outside, which seems to be a staple Verstappen move in the wet, and it was absolutely brilliant. But the most significant impact on his race was his and the team's decision to stay out after the virtual safety car, and that immediately put him in P2, which then followed with a red flag and a free change of tires. So it was good thinking from him and Red Bull to stay out. It was definitely worth the risk, and yes, it was a bit of a risk, but I think it was completely clear the race was going to be stopped. It was just coming down in buckets, the rain was. I was 100% certain that it was going to be stopped. If drivers were going on the wet tires, then I knew it was going to be stopped soon, and Russell and Norris still pitted, and Verstappen made the good decision to stay out, and it paid off for him. And yeah, I just think it was extremely clear that the race was going to be stopped, and I don't think it made any sense to stop at that point. So I think it was a really good call from Verstappen and Red Bull. Verstappen seemed to be really the only one able to overtake throughout the race. He was producing some great moves, and he just seemed to be on another level to everybody else. He managed to catch both Piastri and Ocon absolutely sleeping, which were two crucial moves for his victory. I don't know if they just yeah, I mean, they were just sleeping. They didn't expect him to come up the inside. They just left the door completely open. And I don't know why they didn't even try to defend that. I guess they weren't expecting it. I don't think it was that late of a lunge from Verstappen on either of those moves either, but I guess they just weren't expecting it. Turn 1 was really his main place for overtaking. He just had way more confidence on the brakes, and he was able to brake later than anybody else and just really send it up the inside. He just overall seemed to be the most comfortable driver on the grid. Like, the conditions didn't even matter to him. He was just absolutely cruising throughout the entire race, and even up until the end, the last 10 or 15 laps or so were just fastest lap after fastest laps, and it was really impressive to end the race. Not an entire surprise given that he was the one in clean air, but it was still mighty impressive. And I think that shows the completely contrasting races that Norris and Verstappen had and the difference between those two drivers. Speaking of Lando Norris, let's get into some of his race now. I mean, how many mistakes can a driver sitting on pole with the fastest car make in one single race? The list just goes on and on after this race. Before they even begin the race, he immediately does everything in his power to lose his pole position. That just seems to be a quality of Lando Norris. But of course, he did the second formation lap when the start procedure was aborted and he was not supposed to go again. And then, of course, once they did eventually get going again, he immediately loses the lead to Russell at the first corner. And it's not even like it's a big long drag race to the first corner. It's a very short run down to turn 1. I just couldn't help but start laughing there. I was just like, you've got to be kidding me. After all of that, after all the mistakes he already had, he just immediately loses the position again. And really, I shouldn't have been surprised. He was probably in his head after that formation lap procedure breach. And it was just one more thing to talk about Norris for the season. All of that was just bad enough to begin with. And then, of course, the virtual safety car came out. Russell and Norris, were already past the pit entrance on that lap, so they weren't able to take immediate advantage of it, but the rain was coming down harder than it had been for the rest of the race. It was very clear based on past history that the race was going to be red flagged. I think it was going to even before there was another crash, and yet they still decided to pit Norris, and Russell pitted as well just as the virtual safety car was ending. And then, of course, the red flag came out. They had already lost positions. Verstappen did end up staying out, so he was in second while Norris was in fifth, and Verstappen also got the free stop. So it just really compounded on top of each other what a bad decision it was to stop during that virtual safety car. If it's clear as day to the people watching, I don't know how a team like McLaren and Norris were not able to see that the race was going to be stopped. I don't know why they just wouldn't stay out. It made too much sense. I don't know what they were thinking or not thinking, but when they pitted, that really completely ruined their race. To continue Norris's run of form throughout the race, he of course made a big mistake on the rolling start after the red flag, which caused him to lose out to Russell, and then Sainz had a crash and it caused a safety car, and then Norris manages to make another mistake to lose out even more positions. To top that all off, Norris was 30 seconds behind Verstappen at the end of the race, and I think that was just really telling how bad of a race that was for Norris. He just was not showing the pace at the end. He was not able to overtake. He had so many mistakes, and it was just not a good race for him at all. I think it showed how absolutely pointless it was for McLaren to swap positions in the sprint race. It was literally only 1 point. It would not make any type of difference in the championship hopes. And now look, 1 day later, and the championship is certainly should not even be talked about as Norris having a possibility in it. All of his mistakes just really showed how absolutely pointless it was for McLaren to swap positions in the sprint race. I didn't think it made any sense at the time. It's only 1 point. It's not going to make a difference in this championship. And then, of course, now with hindsight after the race, we can really be certain that it made zero sense at all. But it was just pointless. I know Piastri has had 3 absolute stinkers in a row, but there was no need for them to swap positions in the sprint race for just 1 single point. Now, I've rated Norris pretty highly this year. I think he has done a very good job. I think he is a very good driver. And it is true that he hasn't had as much experience as Verstappen in front running cars, and maybe he's not as battle hardened as Verstappen. But how many mistakes and blunders can one make before we start questioning things? I've left this weekend really rating Norris significantly lower than I would have before the weekend. I mean, maybe it's been the worst weekend of his career, given the significance of the season. I would say at the minimum, it was the worst race of his F1 career, I would say, definitely of the year as well. But yeah, Norris is still certainly a very good driver, but I don't think he belongs anywhere near the same conversation of Verstappen, especially after this race. Up and down the entire grid, there were plenty of mistakes and crashes across all teams and all drivers. With the amount of crashes and spins from drivers up and down the grid, we can tell that it must have been extremely tricky, and it's really no surprise that there were some big crashes because of how tricky the conditions were. But there was definitely some more questionable crashes and mistakes, and some that were a bit more notable than others. Of course, Stroll was one of the big crashes right at the beginning of the race on the formation lap, and that really led to all the chaos. That was bad enough. He spun. Okay, he made a mistake. These things happen. But then he literally just drove out to the gravel and got beached. I don't know. There was literally an escape road that he could have taken. There was numerous different ways he could have just spun the car around to not go into the gravel trap. And then he literally just got stuck there. Like, I don't know. There was just nothing going on in Lance Stroll's brain there, I don't think. I'm not sure what he was thinking, but it was just so appalling to see him just literally drive into the gravel and get stuck in there. I mean, at this point, I wouldn't be sure Stroll knows how to drive a road car, let alone a Formula One car. It's getting that bad. But I think it just shows how he really does not belong in Formula One anymore. He has had some good times and shown some good pace, but I don't even think he wants to be in or even cares about Formula One. I mean, he didn't even acknowledge him driving into the gravel. He just said maybe it was a brake failure or something like that. But he didn't really know. He didn't seem to care that he was out literally before the race even got started. And yeah, it just kind of sums up who Lance Stroll as a driver is nowadays. Of course, another catalyst to some of the chaos of the race was Nico Hülkenberg spinning. And it was a pretty regular spin, but it was at a weird point of the track in the first few corners, I believe it was, on the banking, and he just kind of got stuck on there. It seemed like there was a bit of an edge, and the car literally just got beached there and stuck, and that caused the first VSC of the race. And unfortunately, the marshals did assist him to push him off that little ledge there so that he was able to get back on the track. But because the marshals did assist him, he was given a black flag, which is the first time since 2007 that that's happened. And of course, that meant that he was disqualified from the race. When they said that he was given a black flag, I actually didn't even know what that was. I hadn't heard it in my time of watching Formula One. So it was pretty interesting to learn about that, but definitely a big shame for Hülkenberg and the Haas team to have a disqualification like that. And they wound up with no points from the weekend, at least in the race. I think one of the biggest things that I noticed from this weekend, and particularly the race, is just how experience and the lack of experience amongst the drivers up and down the grid really showed their performances today. I mean, of course, we did have some outliers like Hamilton having an absolute stinker, and of course he's extremely inexperienced, but generally over the course of the grid, some of the newer folks like Colapinto and Behrman had some really scruffy races, while people like Verstappen, who are very experienced, they had extremely good weekends. And then we had some in-betweeners like Alex Albon, who has some good experience now, but maybe he isn't quite as experienced as some of the people like Alonso and Hamilton, and he pushed a little too hard in qualifying and destroyed his car, and it caused him to not be able to start the race. So that was a big mistake on him. Should not have been pushing maybe quite that hard to cause a mistake and a crash like that, because now he's walking away without even being able to start the race. I think where that lack of experience really showed is with Franco Colapinto. Of course, he's been taking the Formula One community by by storm as of late, but he had never driven a Formula One car in the wet before, and he still has only a few races under his belt in a Formula One car overall in the dry, and because of that, it caused him to have a really scruffy race and scruffy weekend overall. Of course, he crashed in qualifying, which he was lucky to even be able to start the race, which wasn't the same for Albon, of course, and then he crashed during the safety car, which was a really poor mistake for him. And I don't know, maybe he was feeling a little extra pressure because he was a little closer to home. He had a lot of support here in Brazil, but it was just not a particularly good weekend for him overall, unfortunately. But I think you will learn an incredible amount from it. Similar to Colapinto, Behrman had a similarly scruffy weekend, maybe even more so. I mean, he didn't necessarily crash in qualifying like Colapinto did, but he was just having incidents left and right throughout the race, and he was spinning like every other lap, it felt like. He got a 10-second penalty for literally running into the back of Colapinto, and he probably didn't really deserve that penalty given it had zero impact on Franco, but it was still just an unnecessary mistake from him. And of course, he also had a very lucky escape to hit the wall, but he was still able to continue on lap 36. So overall, it just felt like he was kind of all over the place and just wasn't able to make any inroads. The last big shunt that I'll talk about is with Carlos Sainz. His crash ended his weekend after another crash in qualifying and an already not so good race. I knew he was going to be a bit behind this weekend, but I did not think he was going to be quite that far behind. He really wasn't making any progress throughout the weekend. He just seemed to be not comfortable and just wasn't necessarily near Leclerc, say nothing about at the top of the grid or at the top of the form like he had been the past 2 weekends. But overall, Ferrari just in general was not super strong this weekend, so I'm sure that certainly had an impact on his performance. One more thing I wanted to touch on is just wet weather racing in Formula One in general. Of course, I love a good wet race, love a good wet qualifying, but I think qualifying probably is a little better in the wet than the actual races are. It is super fun. It causes a lot of chaos like we saw this weekend, but ultimately it's just too difficult for cars to be able to overtake and race with this generation of Formula One cars that we have. Verstappen was really the only one that was successful with it, and these cars just have way too much spray that causes a lack of visibility, at times basically zero visibility. And then as soon as they get off the racing line, they have little to no grip. Now, that was probably because of the resurfacing and just in general. I mean, the racing line gets gripped up across the weekend. But yeah, just overall, it's very difficult to race in wet conditions in Formula One. But despite some of those challenges, I still love a good wet race, a good wet Formula One weekend. And it is always fun to see. It causes a lot of jeopardy. And of course, I don't think we would have saw a double Alpine podium had it not been for the wet craziness of the weekend. But Brazil just produces the absolute best races. I think it's becoming maybe my favorite track on the calendar. It is so good. Of course, it has the weather challenges. They're able to overtake around there generally. It allows for different racing lines, and something is just in the air that is magical around Sao Paulo, and nothing really goes according to plan, and it always produces some awesome races. So let's next move on to my predictions for the weekend versus the actual results. And yeah, if anybody predicted the results of this weekend, then props to you. You should go play the lottery because everything was thrown up in the air with the weather across the weekend. But starting off with sprint qualifying, in P3, I had predicted that Lewis Hamilton would get there and he would have a good weekend because it had been quite some time and he does love this track. But of course, he had an absolutely horrid weekend again. And it was Charles Leclerc who wound up in P3 in sprint qualifying. P2, I had Max Verstappen and it was Norris. P1, I had predicted it would be Norris, and it was actually Piastri who had a really stunning lap at the end of sprint qualifying. For the sprint race, I had predicted in P3 that it would be Verstappen, and it wound up being Charles Leclerc. In P2, I thought it would be Sainz, and he was certainly not there. He had a tough weekend, and it wound up being Oscar Piastri in P2. In P1, I had predicted it would be Lando Norris, and it was Lando Norris, but not in a way that I thought it would. Of course, they did swap the positions at the end of the race, and they were very lucky at the timing of that. Or, if you want to put your conspiracy hat on, it was pretty questionable, the timing that the FIA put out. What was it? The the safety car, the VSC, I can't remember, but it was a little suspect. I don't want to be too conspiracy theorist with that, but it did seem pretty perfect timing. But nonetheless, of course, now and then, we knew already, at least I did, it was entirely pointless for them to swap the positions. 1 point made no difference. I know Piastri was having a hard weekend, but he was performing well. He got on sprint pole, all legit, and yeah, it never made any sense for them to swap positions. And of course, now it really doesn't matter at all. Moving on to regular qualifying, which was of course delayed to the day of the race, which is only, I believe, like the sixth time that that's happened, first time since 2019, which was pretty fun. It was fun to have qualifying and the race on the same day. Definitely was pretty different. And of course, with the weather, it created some chaos and some results that nobody would have anticipated. So I had predicted in P5 that it would be Lewis Hamilton, and of course that didn't happen. I think, what did he end up starting? P14, P12, something like that. Not good for him. And it wound up being Liam Lawson, putting on an absolute show. Him and Yuki Tsunoda, of course, as well. P4, I had predicted that it would be Verstappen, and he had a challenging qualifying, getting knocked down in Q2, I'm sorry, after not being able to get another lap with the red flag. And then of course he had a 5-place grid drop as well. But of course, all of that didn't matter one bit because he went on to win. And of course, in P4, it wound up being Esteban Ocon in qualifying, which nobody would have really predicted. The Alpines doing so well in the wet or overall this weekend as well. P3 in qualifying, I'd predicted that it would be Carlos Sainz, and it was Yuki Tsunoda, who was on fire apparently in qualifying, even though he wasn't so on fire in sprint qualifying. But hey, he did a good job when it really mattered. P2, I'd predicted it would be Lando Norris, and it wound up being Russell. Yeah, who would have predicted that one? But he was pretty close to getting pole position. I didn't expect him to be anywhere near there, given how well Lando Norris was looking throughout this session. He seemed to just be in absolute control, but it wound up being 0.17 seconds, which wasn't too bad. P1, I had predicted it to be Charles Leclerc, and Ferrari just seemed to be on the back foot this weekend. They just weren't super quick like they have been the past couple weekends. But of course, it was Lando Norris who started on pole position. Now for the race in P5, I had predicted that it would be Max Verstappen, and it wound up being Charles Leclerc. P4, I had Oscar Piastri, and it wound up being George Russell. Can't believe he didn't wind up with a podium after all that, but that's how it be. P3, I had predicted it would be Carlos Sainz, and it was Pierre Gasly. Who would have thought that Alpine would do so well this weekend? I mean, props to them for getting a double podium. I mean, only in Brazil, only in 2024 Formula One could we imagine seeing that. P2, I had predicted that it would be Charles Leclerc, and it wound up being Esteban Ocon, of course, who led the race for a period of time. P1, I had predicted it to be Lando Norris, and of course, somehow Max Verstappen came through to win the race. It looked very early on, I tweeted in the race that it looked like Max Verstappen was going to win this race because he was just so much faster than anybody else. He was able to overtake, and he just looked in complete control. And of course, with all the chaos, with the red flags, with the safety cars, all this bunched the field up a little bit more so he could stay in contention, and he wound up with a brilliant victory. My masterclass of the weekend, I had Lewis Hamilton, and he had another shocking weekend. It was filled with many mistakes. He was knocked out of SQ2. He had a poor regular qualifying. He just didn't look good in the dry, in the rain. He couldn't make up any places in the race. And his terrible, terrible run of form just continues. I don't know if it's ever going to end at this rate. It feels like it's going on for a long time, but he needs to get back on track because it is not looking very good. And it's just making me really consider, what does this mean for Lewis Hamilton's future? Like, is he going to continue to struggle from here on out, or is this just a bit of a blip in the radar? I think the first 6 races or so at Ferrari are going to be absolutely vital to see if Hamilton is really as washed as he's looking, or if maybe that Mercedes car is just really that bad or just really not suiting him that well. So it's going to be really interesting to see how he does at Ferrari, because that's going to answer a lot of questions next year. For my disaster class of the weekend, I went with Kevin Magnussen, and of course he definitely had a disaster because he didn't even participate in the weekend. he was sick all weekend and was not able to race. But yeah, I think even if he did end up racing throughout the weekend, I thought that he wouldn't do particularly well because he is so up and down. And after a great result last time out, I thought he would have a poor weekend this time out. But we didn't even get to see. He was just too sick and never got to race at all. My bold prediction was more of maybe a future prediction because only time will tell if I end up being correct. But I was thinking that Perez will get replaced for the rest of the season if he has another really terrible weekend, like him getting knocked out in qualifying, not scoring points, something like that. And of course, he did have a really poor weekend again. But yeah, after Verstappen won from 17th, Perez didn't even score a point, and Lawson scored points ahead of him. I think it's going to be just a matter of when and not if Perez is replaced, and I think rightfully so. He is not doing very well. So the overtake of the race, I have to go with Verstappen's first lap heroics around the outside of turn 3. He's really becoming famous for that racing line, and he proved it once again. He made up multiple positions at that corner, and that really set him up for a successful rest of his race. He was just on another level compared to the rest of the grid, and he fully deserved to win that race, and he's fully deserving to take home this title very soon here. Another shout out for a good overtake on the race was once again Max Verstappen, and it was his overtake on Piastri, and that was really key for him to get by him because the McLaren was such a fast car, at least in the hands of Lando Norris, and I think it just really showed the confidence and precision of Verstappen. Piastri was caught sleeping, but it was still a great move from Verstappen. Of course, another vital and impressive overtake was Verstappen's pass on Ocon for the lead, and I feel like it was pretty similar to Piastri. It was just fully committed, fully precise. He made a good restart, and he did catch Ocon sleeping a little bit, and he got ahead of him, and then he was pulling about a second a lap on Ocon and the rest of the grid for the rest of the race, so that really set him up for victory. So let's look at this championship picture. Norris is 62 points behind Verstappen in the Drivers' Championship. Norris really needed Verstappen to have a DNF this weekend for him to have any hopes, and instead he got absolutely destroyed and outclassed by Verstappen, and yeah, all championship hopes are most definitely done and dusted for Lando Norris. Leclerc is now 24 points behind Norris, and it would have been a good opportunity for Leclerc and Ferrari to make some inroads on Norris and McLaren, but Ferrari wasn't particularly strong this weekend for some reason. They just seem to be lacking a bit of pace, but that battle will continue on for the rest of the season. Even with all the chaos of that race, looking at the championship picture, Sauber is still firmly last without a single point. You would think at a race like this would be an opportunity to score a point, and yet they were not able to score anything, and it's looking like they're not going to score a single point for the entire season, which is pretty shocking for a team that's going to be Audi in a couple years' time. Of course, we have to talk about Alpine making a huge jump up to 6th in the Constructors' Championship. It goes to show and goes to bring up some question marks again about the points scoring system, because in one weekend, Alpine had a good result and they were able to jump from 9th to 6th. Does the entire grid need to get points? I'm not so sure about that, but Alpine took advantage of it, and now they're in 6th, and it's going to be a tight battle for 6th between them, RB, and Haas. Haas was looking really strong, really until the rain came for qualifying in the race. And then, of course, with Magnussen being out and Behrman coming in, that always makes for a challenge. But yeah, they've now lost out 6th in the Constructors. And I think they still have a very good chance of getting that back in the coming races. But it is going to be a tight battle there. Ferrari are now 36 points behind McLaren in the Constructors. And Ferrari never looked like the front-running cars that they had been in the past couple of weeks. And then the Sainz DNF didn't really help any. So they did lose some ground to McLaren this weekend, but that's certainly something that's going to be raging on for the final 3 races of the weekend, and it will be interesting to see how that plays out, but definitely a blow for Ferrari's hopes. With Ferrari's challenging weekend and Max Verstappen's dominance, Red Bull are only 13 points behind Ferrari. It's still tough to imagine them clawing back to 2nd with how poorly Perez is doing, but Ferrari is definitely not safe in 2nd, and they need to be watching their backs as well as watching forward to McLaren. Lastly, because of Alpine's heroics and Williams, what's the opposite of heroics? Just absolute disaster of crashes and not scoring any points. Williams are now firmly in 9th in the Constructors, and it's really unlikely to get any higher at all. I can't imagine them having a 30-point point swing in the final races here. So yeah, what was looking like a potential battle for 6th, 7th, 8th for them, they're now firmly in 9th. They're just lucky that Sauber is actually terrible and can't score a single point to save their life, so they at least aren't going to be last in the constructors. So what did you all think of the Brazilian Grand Prix? It was a fascinating race to me, lots of chaos, lots of fun talking points. What did you all think of Verstappen's absolute brilliance throughout the race, and what did you think about Lando Norris's dropping of the ball this race? Lot of goodies to get into before the next race. We have a bit of a break again before the final triple header of the season, which is pretty crazy that the season is coming to an end. It's been an absolutely brilliant season, but we continue on. If you are interested, give the video a like and a subscribe, and if you're listening on audio podcast, please rate the podcast as well. It means a lot to me. Also, if you're interested, follow me on social media. I'm on X as Last to First Real, first spelled F1RST. On Instagram as Last to First. You can follow me on all the major social media platforms as Last to First, and also on YouTube as Last to First as well. But thank you all for tuning in for my race rundown of the Brazilian Grand Prix, and I look forward to seeing you all next time out.